What if compassion was stronger than instinct? What if, in the deadliest conditions on Earth, the most primal creature chose to trust instead of attack? Deep in the frozen wilderness of the Yukon, where temperatures plummet to 35 degrees and silence stretches like an endless blanket of snow, one man stood alone against the wild. Isolated in a wooden cabin miles from the nearest road, he wasn't just fighting the cold. He was documenting the delicate balance between man and nature. But he didn't expect to be tested by that very balance. Not like this. This is the kind of place where survival is measured in hours, not days. Where wolves, bears, and silence are the only neighbors. Every breath you take crystallizes in the air, and every sound feels like it could awaken something watching from the tree line. That's where it happened. One man, one choice, one animal in desperate need of help, a young cub, alone and trembling, trapped in the unforgiving ice. Not just any cub, but a creature bred by instinct to fear and avoid humans at all costs. His fur matted with frost, eyes barely open, he was the very image of vulnerability. And in that moment, the rules of the wild no longer mattered. What mattered was survival. But not his survival, the cub's. Should he intervene, knowing the pack could be near? Knowing that getting involved could mean becoming prey himself? What followed was an emotional rescue that defied the laws of nature. A silent connection, forged in freezing air and flickering firelight, between a man and a creature of the wild. No words, no promises, only instinct, empathy, and the kind of trust that can't be explained. But the forest never forgets. And when the wolves came for their own, what they did would leave even the most hardened heart shaken. Would you have done the same? Because what happens next isn't just about danger, it's about something much deeper. A story of courage, instinct, and a kind of understanding that only exists in the rawest corners of the earth. Between two species, brought together not by fear, but by choice. And that choice is what changes everything. The moment Liam locked eyes with the wolf cub, something ancient stirred in him. Something deeper than instinct, older than science. But to understand what led to that life-changing encounter, we need to go back a few weeks, to the beginning of Liam's journey into the heart of the frozen north. At 41 years old, Liam wasn't a thrill seeker or some adventurer chasing adrenaline. He was a wildlife biologist from Whitehorse known for his quiet nature, meticulous research, and deep reverence for the animals he studied. After 2 decades immersed in the academic world, he longed for something more than numbers, graphs, and reports. He craved immersion, connection, truth. And so he did what few dared to do. He packed up his life and moved into the wildest corner of Canada's Yukon territory. Why the Yukon? Because it remains one of the last truly untamed regions on Earth. A land where time slows down and the silence speaks louder than civilization ever could. Where wolves roam freely, unbothered by human boundaries, and where nature still operates on its own laws. Uncompromised, unfiltered, unforgiving. Liam built a cabin with his own hands, deep in a remote valley, far from the nearest outpost. No roads, no cell towers, no neighbors, just endless forests, frozen rivers, and the whisper of wind through ancient pines. His purpose wasn't just to survive, but to observe, to document the behavior of local wolf packs during the harshest season of the year. He brought with him solar-powered cameras, satellite notes, survival gear, and a simple rule passed down through every wildlife code of ethics. Observe, never intervene. That rule, to Liam, was sacred. He wasn't there to change the wild, only to witness it. The camera was his journal, the howls at night, his lullaby. Every track in the snow, every echo across the valley became part of a larger story he was trying to understand. The delicate balance of predator, prey, and the cold silence between. Days turned into weeks. His routines were simple. Wake with the frost. Record what he saw. Eat what he preserved. And listen. Always listen. Wolves, he knew, lived by structure, hierarchy, territory, ritual. And as he observed their distant movements from the edge of his camp, he began to understand their rhythm. He had even given them names in his logbook. The dominant female with the golden eyes, the limping male who guarded the rear, the curious yearling who lingered too long near the riverbank. They weren't pets. They weren't characters in a fairy tale. They were wild, raw, and beautiful. But for all the knowledge Liam had, nothing could prepare him for what was coming. One evening, the sun barely brushed the horizon before vanishing into a blanket of snow clouds. The sky turned violet, and the cold crept into the marrow of his bones. Liam had just returned from a long hike, logging fresh tracks and checking one of his motion sensors. As he stoked the fire and boiled water, something caught his attention outside, a faint sound. It wasn't the rustle of wind or the crack of settling ice. It was softer, broken, like breath, like whimpering. That sound would become the moment everything changed. But before we go there, take a second, because if stories like this speak to your heart, if the idea of witnessing the raw emotion of survival, trust, and connection between humans and animals moves you like it moves us, then don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and be part of our Wild Heart connection. There are more stories waiting to be told, more moments like this one, and more reasons to believe in the bond between man and the wild. As Liam stepped out into the growing twilight, snowflakes kissing his cheeks and ice crunching beneath his boots, he moved toward the edge of the tree line. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was fate. All he knew was that the forest had gone still in a way that meant something was about to happen. He took another step forward, and that's when he saw it. Lying half covered in snow, barely moving, was a shape. Small, curled, trembling. A wolf cub, alone, injured, dying. And with that sight, the rule he had sworn to follow, the one that said, observe, never interfere, began to break. Quietly, slowly, but undeniably. Because sometimes the wild doesn't just show us something to study. Sometimes it asks us to act. Liam froze as his eyes adjusted to the dim light beneath the thick canopy of snow-covered spruce. At first he thought it might have been a fallen branch, or maybe a snowdrift twisted by the wind. But then it moved. Just barely. The soft, erratic rise and fall of breath, shallow, labored, barely visible in the bitter cold. His boots crunched cautiously forward, his breath clouded before him like a ghost. And there, curled in a helpless knot, was a wolf cub. Small, fragile, half buried in snow. Its tiny ribs trembled under a coat of ice-matted fur. Its eyes were half closed, glazed with exhaustion and cold, but there was still life in them. Faint, flickering, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a storm. Liam's heart slammed against his ribs. Every part of his training told him to stop, to turn back, to log the observation and leave nature to take its course. This was the code. This was the contract. Wildlife biologists did not interfere with the balance. It was not their role to save. They observed. They documented. They never became part of the story. But this wasn't just science now. This wasn't just a data point. This was suffering, real, present, and impossible to ignore. Liam took a slow step forward, lowering himself to one knee. He didn't reach out right away. Instead, he simply observed, not as a scientist, but as a human being. The cub was no more than a few weeks old. Its paws were still too large for its body. Its fur still held that dense fluff of a young pup, not yet hardened by months in the cold. Its back leg was twisted in a frozen tangle of brush, likely caught during a panicked sprint or forced separation. Blood had stained the ice beneath the limb, and the cub whimpered when a gust of wind raked across its body. He couldn't leave it there. Liam's hands, gloved and shaking slightly from adrenaline, moved with care. He knelt lower and gently brushed the snow away from the cub's back. The animal flinched, a soft growl caught in its throat, but it lacked the strength to resist. Slowly, painstakingly, Liam began to unravel the frozen branches trapping its leg. Each twig seemed fused to the ice, and he had to work delicately to avoid worsening the injury. He didn't speak. He didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, respectful, as if he were asking permission with every touch. Finally, with one last snap of brittle wood, the cub's leg came free. It collapsed immediately, too weak to stand. Liam removed his outer parka and wrapped the cub inside, pulling it gently against his chest. The body was ice-cold, rigid, but he could feel the faint drum of a heartbeat. Time wasn't on his side. Not in this temperature. Not with the sun already sinking. The trek back to the cabin would take at least 40 minutes through uneven terrain. Carrying an injured cub would slow him down even more. But he had no choice. Not now. This wasn't about breaking protocol anymore. It was about saving a life. As Liam walked, the wind grew stronger, and the snow fell harder. Every step felt like a battle against the elements. He kept one hand cupped over the cub's muzzle, shielding it from the worst of the cold, whispering softly. Not words of comfort, but instinctive murmurs. The kind of sounds we make when we're not even aware we're speaking. As if the rhythm of his voice alone could anchor that fragile life a little longer. Back at the cabin, the fire was still smoldering. He threw on more wood, stirred the embers to life, and carefully laid the cub in a wool-lined box near the stove. Then began the careful work of reviving it. Warm water on cloth, gently wiping away ice from the paws and ears. A shallow bowl of bone broth left nearby just in case the cub stirred. For hours, Liam stayed by its side, monitoring, waiting, hoping. He didn't even realize he had started calling the cub Akiak until he wrote it in his journal that night. Akiak, the brave one. A name from the Inuit traditions of the North. It felt right. Not just because of the cub's tenacity in surviving, but because Liam needed to believe in that bravery too. He needed to believe that what he'd done wasn't foolish or emotional or weak. He needed to believe that it meant something. But that night, as the wind howled outside and the little body by the fire barely moved, doubt settled heavy on his shoulders. What if he'd only prolonged the inevitable? What if he had made a mistake? What if the pack was still nearby? Watching. Liam had documented wolf behavior long enough to know how fiercely protective a pack could be, especially during the early months of a pup's life. He knew how quickly they could turn aggressive if they believed one of their own had been taken or harmed. Bringing Akiak inside wasn't just a risk to the cub, it was a risk to himself. If the pack came looking, they wouldn't knock. And yet as the hours passed and Akiak remained breathing, something in the air began to shift. A flick of the ear, a twitch of the paw. By dawn, the cub had opened its eyes, fully this time, and Liam saw something that stole his breath. Recognition. There was no fear, no panic, just quiet awareness. As if Akiak understood, on some wordless level, that this human had pulled him back from the edge. Liam didn't reach out. He didn't move closer. He simply watched. Respectfully, gratefully, and in that moment, the line between man and beast began to blur. Because maybe this wasn't just about saving the cub. Maybe, just maybe, Liam was the one being saved. The hours passed slowly that first night like melting ice, silent, uncertain, heavy with weight. Inside the small wooden cabin, the wind howled as if trying to claw its way through the cracks in the logs. But near the stove, wrapped in a soft blanket that once belonged to Liam's old husky, lay a young wolf cub, fighting for life. Akiak, the brave one. The name already felt like more than a label. It felt like a vow, like a fragile promise that survival was still possible. Liam had barely slept. He stayed close but never hovered, watching for any flicker of strength in the cub's eyes, any movement that hinted at willpower returning. He tried offering food, warm broth, small pieces of softened meat, but Akiak turned his face away, too weak or too afraid to accept. His body had endured hours, maybe days of exposure. Now it was caught between two worlds, the cold outside that nearly took him, and the unknown warmth within this strange, quiet shelter. Liam spoke very little, not because he didn't want to talk, but because words felt too big, too clumsy. The space between them wasn't made for language, it was made for instinct, respect, patience. On the second day, something changed. It was morning. Pale light poured in through the frosted window, painting long blue streaks across the wooden floor. Liam sat near the stove, sipping a mug of bitter pine tea when he felt it, eyes on him. Not just a glance, not a startled flick. but a steady gaze. He turned his head slowly. Akiak was looking at him, not with fear, not with desperation, just seeing him. And in that moment, the air between them shifted. There was no tail wag, no purr, no need for physical contact, just stillness and trust. Liam didn't move. He simply returned the gaze, holding space, letting the silence do the work. It was a moment so raw, so strangely powerful, that it left a knot in his throat. That was the first time he realized that the bond forming here wasn't a product of rescue or gratitude. It was something else, something older than understanding. He knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't what scientists were taught to do. No textbooks covered the emotional tether forming between a researcher and a wild animal. But Liam also knew that the forest didn't operate by human rules. It moved in rhythms of energy and instinct. And here, inside this simple cabin, two creatures from different worlds had met in a space outside of logic. Akiak began to eat that night, cautiously, slowly. At first, he took only one piece of meat, chewing without enthusiasm. But by midnight, the small bowl had been emptied. A good sign. A sign that the flame inside him hadn't gone out. Liam made no sudden gestures. He moved quietly around the room, letting the cub acclimate to his scent, his steps, his routine. He even began sleeping on the floor near Akiak's box. Not too close, but close enough that the cub never felt entirely alone. Trust, Liam knew, wasn't something that could be forced. It was earned breath by breath, night by night. Each morning brought subtle progress. Akiak would lift his head when Liam entered the room. He would sniff the air. He would allow the edge of the blanket to brush his side without flinching. These were not milestones you'd find in veterinary notes or scientific logs, but to Liam, they meant everything. They were the language of survival, spoken without sound. One morning, Liam found Akiak standing, wobbly, uneven, but standing nonetheless. That day, the sun felt warmer, not because the temperature had changed, but because hope had. Liam began recording everything in his journal, not just as data, but as memory. He wrote down the cub's reactions, his eating patterns, his breathing during the night. But most of all, he wrote about the silence, the comfortable kind, the silence between them that no longer felt empty but alive, charged with understanding. Still, Liam never forgot where they were. This was wolf country. This was the Yukon. And the forest outside didn't pause just because something miraculous was happening inside the walls of a cabin. Wolves don't forget their own. Packs are not just families. They are ecosystems of loyalty and survival. And every minute that Akiak spent away from his pack, Liam knew he was walking a razor's edge. If the pack was nearby, and deep down he believed they were, then his cabin was no longer just a place of healing. It was a beacon. But what choice had he had? Let the cub die? Let nature run its course while he sat by and took notes? Would that have been more ethical? More scientific? He didn't know anymore. What he did know was this. In his entire career of studying wildlife, nothing had ever moved him like this moment. Nothing had ever made him question the boundaries between observer and participant so deeply. And whether it was right or wrong in the eyes of the scientific community, it felt true. Akiak's eyes told him that. Not with words, but with presence. Now I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Liam's place? Would you have walked away as the rules say you should? Or would you have stepped in, knowing the risks? Would you have broken the code to protect a life? Let us know in the comments below. Because your voice matters. Your instinct, your empathy. It's part of this journey too. As night fell again over the Yukon, the fire crackled low and the cabin seemed smaller somehow. Not because the space had changed, but because the space between two beings had closed. And while Liam watched Akiak sleep, curled now in a tight ball, no longer shivering, breathing steady and strong, he realized something else. Maybe this wasn't just a rescue. Maybe it was the beginning of something he could never have predicted. Something that would pull him deeper into the wild than he had ever gone before. The days that followed moved with a quiet rhythm. the kind that only deep wilderness can teach, a rhythm built not on clocks or calendars, but on instinct, observation, and small silent victories. Outside, the Yukon stretched on in endless white. Snow continued to fall like breath from the sky, covering the landscape in fresh layers of stillness. The winds howled at night like ancient voices echoing through the pines, but inside the cabin, something else was beginning to stir. Life. Akiak, the little wolf cub once frozen and frail, had begun to heal. The transformation was subtle at first, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know him. But Liam noticed everything. It started with a stretch. A soft grunt in the early hours as Akiak uncurled himself near the wood stove. Then came the slow, cautious steps across the wooden floor. The way he would sniff the air when Liam cooked. The way he'd glance over when Liam adjusted the logs in the fire. There was a spark coming back to him. Not just survival, but awareness. Curiosity. It was no longer just about keeping him alive. It was about learning to live again. Every morning, Liam would make his tea and sit near the stove with a pencil and journal in hand. His notes had shifted. Once filled with clinical observations and distant reflections, they now read like letters to an old friend. Akiak stood for 12 seconds today, stronger on the right leg, watched me chop firewood through the window, tilted his head. There was affection in those lines, unspoken, maybe even unconscious, but real. Akiak began to follow Liam, not in a pet-like way, but as if guided by an invisible thread of trust. When Liam moved from the stove to his desk, the cub would slowly rise, hobble over, and lie back down. When Liam opened the door to retrieve firewood, Akiak would sit at a distance, his ears alert but body calm, never trying to bolt, never showing fear, just watching, like a sentinel, like a shadow made of fur and breath. And always, there was the fire. The fire had become their shared world. Akiak often slept curled in a tight circle beside it, the flames painting orange across his gray coat. Sometimes, late at night, Liam would wake and see Akiak sitting up, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Quiet, contemplative, almost human. He'd watch the fire as if it held some ancient story only he could hear. It was in those quiet hours that the bond between them deepened, not through actions or commands, but through the absence of both. No leash, no collar, no tricks, just presence, just being. Liam had never experienced anything like it. As a wildlife biologist, he'd spent years learning the boundaries, how to respect the wild without interfering, how to avoid anthropomorphizing, how to draw clear lines between man and beast. But Akiak blurred all those lines. He didn't act like a domestic dog. He didn't come when called. He didn't lick hands or wag a tail. What he offered instead was something far more sacred: shared space, unspoken permission, coexistence. Liam remembered one morning in particular. It had snowed heavily the night before, and the cabin was blanketed in thick silence. As Liam opened the door to shovel the steps, Akiak stood just behind him, gazing at the untouched world beyond. Liam didn't stop him, didn't close the door. He just waited. Akiak took one step out into the snow, then another, and then he turned back. Just turned, walked back inside, and curled beside the stove again as if to say, "Not yet. Not today." That moment hit Liam harder than he expected, because it wasn't fear that brought Akiak back inside. It was choice, and somehow that made all the difference. The connection growing between them was unlike anything Liam had ever known. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't control. It was trust, pure and wordless. He began to understand the wolf's rhythms, its cues, the twitch of an ear that meant discomfort, the way his breath slowed when Liam sat nearby, the brief tail flick that meant he was dreaming. Liam started reading less and watching more. He cooked more simply, spoke more softly, even moved more deliberately, as if the cabin itself had become a kind of sanctuary not just for Akiak, but for something deeper inside himself. The stillness they shared, the breath of the fire, the snow outside pressing against the glass, it all felt connected. And in Akiak's eyes, Liam no longer saw fear. He saw belonging. One evening, as the sky turned lavender and dusk settled over the valley, Liam sat beside the fire with his journal open but blank. Akiak lay close, his head resting on crossed paws, his eyes half-lidded. Liam didn't write that night. He just sat in silence, watching the shadows move, listening to the breath of the fire and the quiet of the cub. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't wanted to admit until now. He was no longer just documenting a story. He was living one. One he could never fully explain. One that didn't need explaining. And deep in his chest, beneath all the scientific training and rational boundaries, Liam felt it rising. The truth of it all. This connection was not a fluke, not a mistake. It was something that nature had allowed, and perhaps even intended. But nature is never still for long. And out there, beyond the safety of the cabin walls, the forest was listening, watching, waiting, and soon it would answer. It started with a sound. Not loud, not startling, but unmistakable. A howl. Long, low, and distant, drifting through the trees like an ancient song woven into the wind. Liam had heard wolves before, of course, during his research trips, through recordings, even outside the cabin in the earliest days of his stay. But this was different. This one was personal. It didn't just echo. It pierced. It carried weight. A kind of resonance that reached straight into the bones. Akiak felt it too. The young cub, now stronger, more alert, was curled near the fire when his ears suddenly twitched. He lifted his head slowly, eyes narrowing, body frozen. Not with fear, but with attention. His nose tilted upward. His breath paused. Then he turned his face toward the window, toward the darkness beyond the glass. He didn't move for a long time. Just stared, like he was listening to something Liam couldn't hear. Or maybe remembering something Liam couldn't see. That night, the air around the cabin changed. The next morning, Liam stepped outside with his usual caution, only to stop dead in his tracks. Snow stretched untouched in all directions, except for a trail. Paw prints, deep, wide, unmistakable. Not from a single animal, but from several. They circled the cabin in a loose, thoughtful arc. Not chaotic, not rushed, but deliberate, purposeful, the kind of movements wolves make when they're not hunting, but observing. Liam knelt beside one of the tracks, pressed his glove to the snow, still fresh, maybe made within the last 2 hours. He looked up, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but he felt it, eyes, watching, and suddenly, the weight of his choices came back to him. He had taken in a wolf cub, a member of a pack, a creature not meant to live by human firelight. Akiak's family had not forgotten. They had found them, and now they were waiting. Every instinct told Liam to be alert. Wolves were intelligent, territorial, loyal. If they believed he had taken one of their own, their response could be unpredictable. He was alone out here. No phone, no neighbors, just one man, one cub, and the unforgiving cold between them and the wild. But oddly, Liam didn't feel afraid. Not yet, because this didn't feel like a threat. Not exactly. It felt like a test, a moment of reckoning. Over the next few days, the signs continued. Each morning, new tracks appeared, never closer than 20 feet from the cabin, but always in the same silent circle. Once Liam found a mark in the snow, a deep imprint of a body lying down, as if one of them had rested there, watching. At night, howls came more frequently, not frenzied, not aggressive, but long and clear, as if calling out, as if asking. And Akiak changed. He stopped sleeping deeply. His ears twitched with every sound. He began to pace near the door. He'd sit by the window for hours, eyes fixed on a single point far into the trees. Sometimes he would let out the softest whine, not of distress, but of longing. His body was still in the cabin, but his spirit, it was already halfway into the woods. Liam watched this with a knot in his chest. This was the part of the story no one prepares you for. the part where healing turns into release, where connection demands sacrifice. He had saved Akiak's life, given him warmth, food, safety. He had shared his silence, his space, his trust. And in return, the cub had offered him something rare, a glimpse into wildness without fear, a mirror of instinct without violence. But wolves are not meant to stay. Nature doesn't forget, and neither do wolves. One morning, Liam opened the door to retrieve wood and found something he hadn't expected. A fresh kill, a rabbit, carefully placed on the steps, not torn, not eaten, just left. A gift? A warning? He didn't know. But it was no accident. The pack was close now, closer than ever. That evening, Akiak didn't sleep by the fire. Instead, he lay near the door, curled up with his nose against the crack beneath the frame. He barely moved, barely blinked, as if waiting, as if listening for a voice older than memory. Liam sat on the floor a few feet away, not speaking, not writing, just breathing. He looked at Akiak, the curve of his back, the way his chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the wind. He saw the wild in him again, the part that no fire could tame. And he knew, this bond, as beautiful and rare as it was not permanent. It couldn't be, because Akiak didn't belong to him. He belonged to the forest, to the pack, to something far greater than any one man could offer. And Liam, with all the ache building in his chest, understood that love, real love, wild love, sometimes meant letting go. But not yet, not tonight, because tonight, they were still here, together, in the flicker of firelight, in the breath between silence and sound. And if this moment moved you even a little, if something in this story makes your heart feel what words can't quite express, then let it be known. Hit that like button. Let's show the world how powerful connection can be, not just between people, but between souls. The cabin creaked under the weight of snow. The fire whispered its slow, steady rhythm. Akiak blinked once, then looked at Liam, and in that look was something eternal, something ancient, and something just about to change. The decision came before the sunrise, in the deepest hours of the night, when the fire was low and the wind whispered secrets through the logs of the cabin. Liam lay awake on the floor, his back against the wall, Akiak dozing quietly a few feet away. But sleep didn't visit Liam. Not anymore. His mind was full of footprints in the snow, of glowing eyes watching from the shadows, of howls calling something ancient to life inside the young cub now curled at his door. He had known this moment was coming. From the day he first carried Akiak out of the frozen bush, wrapped in his parka, trembling and silent, some part of Liam had already understood. This was never forever. Wolves are not meant to be kept. They are not meant to be claimed. They belong to the snow, the shadows, the silence between trees. And Akiak, despite the warmth of the fire and the safety of the cabin, had begun to hear the forest calling him home. Liam had seen the signs. The way Akiak's ears perked at each distant howl. The way he sniffed the air, catching scents that Liam would never recognize. The way he stared out into the night for hours, unmoving, alert, his body tense with memory. He wasn't just healing anymore. He was remembering where he came from, who he was, what he was meant to be. So, as the first light began to brush the horizon in pale gold, Liam made his choice. He stood slowly, wrapping his coat tightly around him, slipping on his boots. The air inside the cabin felt different now, thinner, heavier. Akiak stirred as Liam moved, blinking up at him with calm, knowing eyes. There was no panic, no resistance, just awareness, just readiness. Liam knelt beside him, running a hand gently down the cub's side, fingers brushing the place where fur had once been matted with frost and blood. That patch had healed, strong and smooth now, like it had never been broken. He whispered, not even sure what he said. Not commands, not farewells, just breath, sound, a quiet vibration of the bond they'd built. Then, together, They stepped outside into the cold morning air. The snow was deep, untouched. The sun had barely risen, but the sky was beginning to glow behind the line of trees. The world was silent, not empty, just listening. Liam walked slowly, cradling Akiak in his arms, the cub still light, but solid now, alive with muscle and memory. They moved toward the tree line, the place where snow met shadow, where the forest thickened and the trail vanished. Liam's breath came out in soft clouds, his boots crunching softly beneath him. Each step felt final, like closing a chapter he hadn't wanted to end. He reached the edge of the trees and paused. For a moment, everything stood still. Akiak turned his head, nose lifted, body tensing, not with fear, but with alertness. Recognition. And then, it happened. The sound. The soft, deliberate crunch of snow. Not from behind, from the forest ahead. Liam looked up. They were there. 6 adult wolves stepped into view, emerging from the trees like ghosts becoming flesh. They moved slowly, not in a rush, not like hunters, but like something older. Ceremonial. Purposeful. Their eyes fixed not on Liam, but on the cub in his arms. They came forward until they formed a wide arc around him. Half circle at first, then wider, until Liam realized. He was surrounded. 6 wolves. Silent. Watching, his breath caught. He expected growls, a flash of teeth, a show of force. He was trespassing. He had taken one of theirs. Wolves don't forget. But nothing came. No aggression. No warning. Only stillness. And then, reverence. From the center of the group, a wolf stepped forward, larger than the others. Lean, but powerful. Her coat was a rich mix of gray and amber, her eyes glowing gold in the morning light. The alpha. No question. Her posture was calm, but commanding. She didn't run. She didn't lower her gaze. She simply walked toward Liam. Every instinct in his body screamed to stay still. So he did. The alpha came within a few feet, close enough for him to see the frost clinging to her fur, the scars along her snout, evidence of battles fought and survived. She looked not at Liam, but at Akiak, and Akiak looked back. Liam crouched, slowly, gently placing the cub on the snow. Akiak stood without hesitation, his body straight, his head high, no longer frail, no longer wounded. For a few seconds he simply stood there, caught between 2 worlds, the warmth he'd known, and the wild he'd come from. Then the alpha took one more step forward, and something incredible happened. She didn't take Akiak immediately. Instead, she nudged him, softly, toward Liam. A gesture so simple and yet filled with meaning. A pause. A moment of recognition. Not ownership, not confrontation, but gratitude. A blessing. Akiak turned his head toward Liam one last time, and in that look was everything. Not fear, not sadness, just understanding. Then he turned again and walked to the alpha. She touched her nose to his forehead, and the circle shifted. The pack moved as one, turning toward the trees. Akiak followed, his stride still young, but steady. He didn't look back again. He didn't need to, because some goodbyes don't require second glances. Liam remained kneeling in the snow, heart pounding. He didn't move. Not until the last tail vanished into the shadows of the forest. Not until the silence returned, thick and sacred. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from the cold. The forest was empty again, at least to the eyes. But everything had changed. He could still feel the energy of their presence, the way the earth had held its breath, the way the wind had whispered through the trees. Something ancient had happened here. Something that no camera, no field report, no research article could ever capture. A moment where 2 worlds, wild and human, had met not in conflict, but in ceremony. And Liam knew, deep in his chest, that this was not the end. It was only the crossing. Liam stood motionless in the snow, breath shallow, heart echoing the last footfalls of the pack as they melted into the forest. The sound of paws brushing the powdery white faded like a heartbeat, slipping into silence. But before the trees swallowed them completely, one of the wolves, the alpha female, paused. Her golden eyes turned back, locking with his for a fleeting, unforgettable moment. It wasn't just a glance. It wasn't a warning. It was something else. A recognition. A message without language. And then she was gone. All that remained was the whisper of wind, the hush of untouched snow, and the impression, so faint but unmistakable, that something sacred had just unfolded beneath the open sky. Liam exhaled slowly. Not out of fear, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of something he didn't have a name for. In the absolute stillness that followed, a strange sensation began to rise inside him. A calm so deep it bordered on reverence. Peace. But not the kind found in silence or solitude. This was something ancient, earned, shared. He wasn't just a man in the woods anymore. He had been seen, not as an intruder, not as a threat, but as a participant, a witness, someone trusted, if only for a moment, with a life that didn't belong to him. He looked down at the paw prints scattered across the clearing. Fresh, powerful, wild. Akiak's prints were smaller, more delicate, trailing between those of his kin. No longer alone, no longer limping. The trail bent slightly to the left, curving around the edge of a pine-covered hill before vanishing into the thick timber. Liam memorized every inch of it, and in that moment, he didn't feel the sting of letting go. He felt the warmth of having been part of something real. That's the thing about moments like these, unimaginable moments. They arrive without warning, they don't ask for permission, and they never linger. But if you're lucky enough to recognize one as it's happening, it stays with you, forever. He took a step back from the clearing, crunching softly through the snow, retracing his path toward the cabin. With every step, the weight in his chest seemed to shift. Not disappear, but transform. The ache of goodbye became the rhythm of gratitude. The chill of early dawn became the memory of firelight. And the silence that once screamed of isolation now whispered of connection. Back at the cabin, Liam didn't light the fire immediately. He didn't write in his journal or unpack his coat. Instead, he stood by the window, eyes fixed on the forest, heart still echoing with the presence that had filled that space only minutes ago. Somewhere out there, Akiak was beginning a new chapter. Running between trees, his instincts awakening, his breath syncing with the rhythm of the pack. And yet Liam could still feel him. Not in a mystical sense, but in the way that memory and meaning take root in the body. Deep, unshakable, alive. He thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The rescue, the healing, the unspoken trust, the silent understanding that grew stronger with each day, and finally the release. The moment that had shattered every rule and rewritten everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between man and animal. There was no data for this, no protocol. No page in his field guide could prepare him for the rawness of it all. But it was real, it was true, and that made it enough. Now, as Liam stared out into the trees, he wondered just how many stories like this one had gone untold. How many moments, shared between species, across boundaries, against instinct, had been missed, ignored, or silenced by fear. And how many hearts around the world would feel this story the way he felt it. So now I want to turn to you, the one watching, the one listening, the one whose heart might be feeling something you can't quite explain right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? Are you surrounded by trees like Liam? Or maybe concrete buildings and city lights? Have you ever looked into the eyes of an animal and felt understood? Have you ever felt a bond form without words? Let's connect across borders because these stories, these moments, they belong to all of us. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you in the world right now? Your voice matters here. Your presence makes this connection real. The cabin felt different now. Not just quieter, but hallowed, like the air itself had absorbed the echoes of the morning before. Liam sat at his small wooden table by the window, the fire crackling faintly behind him. Akiak's empty spot beside the stove still held the shape of his rest, a soft dent in the fur blanket where he used to curl. Liam didn't rush to smooth it out. He let it be, as if to preserve what was left of the warmth that once lived there. Outside, the forest was still, The sky had turned a pale silver, the sun rising without ceremony behind layers of snow clouds. Liam opened his field journal, the same one he'd used to record data, track behavior, log migration routes, measure patterns. But now, he hesitated. The pen in his hand didn't feel like a tool for science. It felt like a bridge between what he'd witnessed and what he was still trying to understand. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Today I didn't just observe the wild. I became part of it." The sentence lingered on the paper, as if the ink itself was aware that something sacred had just been said. It was true. All of it. For the first time in his life, Liam hadn't just studied nature. He had entered it. Quietly, without force, without demand. He had been accepted, if only temporarily, into a world that so often shuts humans out. He looked out the window again, half expecting the clearing to be empty, untouched. But it wasn't. There, in the snow near the edge of the porch, was something new. A piece of fresh meat, not scavenged, not spoiled, placed cleanly, deliberately. The snow around it was undisturbed except for a single trail of paw prints that led in and out. No mess, no struggle, just a gesture, a message, a gift, a test, or perhaps something more profound, a thank you, shaped not in words, but in the wild's own language. Liam stepped outside, the cold biting against his skin, and knelt near the offering. He didn't touch it. He didn't disturb it. Instead, he simply knelt and watched, breathing, listening, receiving. It wasn't just about what was given. It was about what it meant. Because in that small, silent gesture, nature had spoken again, and it had said, "We saw you, we remember, and we understand." Liam had spent years chasing knowledge through data, graphs, distance. But what he'd found here was something no measurement could quantify: instinctual gratitude. A form of emotional intelligence so ancient, so raw, it bypassed logic entirely. Animals may not use words, but they speak. With eyes, with posture, with choice, with silence. And in those languages they express what humans often fail to: presence, respect, and a kind of sacred empathy that doesn't need translation. That morning, Liam didn't feel alone. He felt connected. To the forest, to Akiak, to the mystery that lives between species when fear gives way to trust. And that mystery was just beginning to unfold. As the fire crackled softly behind him and the light of the forest filtered through the cabin window, Liam closed his journal and looked out one final time. The snow had started falling again, soft, delicate, like the world was gently resetting itself. But something had changed. Inside him, around him, between him and the wild. He had crossed a line, not of danger, but of depth, a quiet transformation. What had started as a rescue had become a revelation. The bond he formed with Akiak wasn't just survival, it was meaning. A shared thread between species, a reminder that beneath instinct, beneath biology, there is something universal. The desire to connect, to trust, to be seen. And if you've made it this far in the story, maybe you felt it too. Because this story wasn't just about Liam or the wolves. It was about the part of you that knows there's more to life than noise. That believes in the power of silent connection, in the language of presence, in the truth that nature speaks, not with words, but with feeling. So if this story touched your heart, if it stirred something quiet and deep within you, if it reminded you that the wild is not something outside of us, but something within us, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to Wild Heart Connection, where every story is real, every emotion is true, and every moment reminds us that between humans and animals, there's a space where magic lives. Click on the next video that just appeared on your screen. It's another true story, another bridge between species, another way nature speaks through emotion. Let's keep walking this path together.